Your body's, your baby's brain immune cells are literally being programmed for danger every time they're left to cry it out. This may have been your experience given the generation that you grew up in of learning to sleep by yourself by having to cry it out. But once programmed, these cells can stay hypersensitive for life. Welcome to the biology behind it. This is a mini episode of the biology behind the trauma science. And I'm Dr. Amy, your host, and today we're diving deep into a question that I received since releasing the main episode. So the question was, a podcast listener and pediatric nurse practitioner, Kendra, asked me a question on LinkedIn after this week's episode. She said, "Hi, Dr. Amy. After listening to your episode with Dr. Narvaez, I was struck by the mention of brain inflammation in babies. Can you explain more about what's actually happening in their brains when we leave them to cry it out? How does this actually create the anxiety and depression we see later? Can you explain further?" Thank you for your question, Kendra. And this is one of the aspects around what can happen in our early life does shape our biology. I call that a biology of trauma and what you need to know about that. So this is a deep dive into the larger podcast episode. Again, that podcast episode is 132. And this is with guest Dr. Darshan Narvaez. And really, we went into the early childhood experiences that you would think are common parenting practices, but actually create anxiety and even addiction later on in life. So I strongly encourage you to listen to that full episode. It had so many great nuggets. Now, as we look at the biology behind it, she mentioned how these experiences shape our biology, shape our neurobiology in ways that lead to anxiety, depression, and addiction. Even sometimes an aspect of suicidal intentions later on in life. So what's actually happening inside those tiny brains? And let's dive into the biology. For me, this aspect of understanding the biology of my brain inflammation was a critical piece in my healing journey as I started to do trauma therapy. In fact, I noticed that early on, my brain inflammation, and what we'll go into is these hypersensitive immune cells in my brain, were a big part of what was holding me back and getting me overwhelmed as I proceeded with my own trauma therapy. And so by understanding that this was part of my story, part of my biology, then we look at the aspect of what can we do about the brain inflammation? What can we do about the biology that is keeping us stuck? So let's go into that. Sometimes once we understand our past, we can see why we might have these experiences around the priming. So with that, let's talk about what cells exactly are getting primed in our brain, and specifically early on with our biology. With the biology, what's happening is that there are immune cells that are there to guard our neurons. These immune cells are called microglia, and they are critical to our stress and our stress capacity. So as we have these immune cells that are supposed to be taking care of our neurons, these these cells that respond to stress can become hypersensitive to stress. So how do they become hypersensitive to stress? These cells, again, are called microglia, and they are a large part the biology behind childhood stress. And when we look at the biology of these microglia, when they experience a certain amount of stress early on, where it's too much stress for their capacity, then they become primed. They unleash a large amount of inflammation, and they never go back to being the same. They remain primed. So now there are three states that are possible. One state is the resting state. Now they're not actually resting. They are doing their work, but they're not in activation mode, which activation for these immune cells means creating inflammation and cellular damage. And The resting state is where you want them as you go into your adulthood and you are wanting to have relief from anxiety, have relief from depression, because this inflammation caused by these cells are going to have that impact. But the other state is this activation state. So once the microglia cells are primed, they can either be in a resting state, doing their job, or they can be in an activated state where they are unleashing inflammation. And you would know that by the experience of brain fog and decision fatigue, and your brain can feel heavy and it's hard to think and it's hard to do things. Your eyes might become more sensitive to light. These are all ways in which we can recognize, my microglia have gone from their resting state into activation state. And so looking at certain experiences in our childhood that would have primed these microglia can help us understand why we have the current capacity that we have now for our brain responding to certain stressors and getting overwhelmed by others. These cells are at the forefront of that decision of whether this will be a stress for me, for us, or whether this will be a trauma for our body. Again, I go through the 5 steps of the trauma response in chapter 1 of my book. So if you want more details on that, that is where you can find that information for knowing that there is a line that is crossed between stress and trauma. Looking at our life experiences, our early childhood experiences, then we are more vulnerable, we are more sensitive, our nervous system is immature, meaning our nervous system hasn't fully developed to be able to handle the stress that we can handle now as adults. When the amount of stress that we are encountering exceeds the capacity for these immune cells in our brain, they become primed. One of those examples is if we had birth trauma. So birth trauma is high stress. The baby is in distress. There is oftentimes some idea of lack of oxygen. Maybe the cord was wrapped around their neck, or maybe they are inside and not able to get out. Their heart rate is increasing. This is a level of stress that will prime these microglia, that can prime these microglia. Also, being born premature. Being born premature means that our nervous system is even more immature, which means that it doesn't take much stress to overwhelm our nervous system and these immune cells at that time. Even going to the NICU or the neonatal ICU, that can be a reason for a high amount of stress that will activate these microglia and prime them. And when they are primed, they are never the same again. So once they are primed, they will have a tendency to go into this activation state with other stress. And with other stress that is not as big as other stressors that other people can handle. And it's due to these cells becoming primed. They stay hypersensitive. Now, there's a lot that we can do about that, and that's why I wanted to share the biology behind it. Because as we look at the example from our podcast episode, again, episode 132 with Dr. Narvaez on crying it out. Something as simple as crying it out to fall asleep. Sometimes that level of stress for that baby to have to cry it out without anybody being there, it experiences a level of fear. It experiences a level of rage that no one is listening, creates the felt sensation of being all alone. And then it falls into sleep with exhaustion rather than with feeling safe and secure. The baby will fall asleep feeling afraid, feeling fearful, wondering, am I going to survive this? That level of fear and panic is often the level of emotional stress that we are seeing primes these immune cells in the brain. This is one example of how common parenting practices is actually starting to instill a biology of trauma that over the years accumulates and causes disease as adulthood. And we as adults would never know to think back and say, oh, well, it started when my parents, with good intentions, hopefully good intentions, had me sleep trained through crying it out. Now, Dr. Narvaez used a very specific word in her interview with me, and I want to share that word with you because it really holds the element of the degree of emotional distress that we're talking about. And the word that she used was abyss. When babies are left to cry it out, they experience a rage, but they feel that they are in an abyss. Now, that's a very unique word to use. What does that word mean to you? What that word means to me is that it's this feeling of, I don't know if I will survive this. An abyss to me means I don't know where the bottom of this is. I don't know how deep this goes. I don't know how far I'm going to fall, which brings me back to my point of I don't know if I will survive this. And so this is a key concept of how a biology of trauma even forms. So how a biology of trauma forms is that we have nervous system dysregulation that will be created by crying it out to fall asleep because of the level of fear, the level of rage, and the level of aloneness that a baby will experience. Creates nervous system dysregulation. Well, that nervous system dysregulation creates biology changes. One of those changes featured here is oxidative stress, but I have up here, it creates the activated microglia. The activated microglia are now going to feed back and create more oxidative stress, which actually creates more nervous system dysregulation. And this is how something as early as crying it out to sleep can actually still be causing us problems as adults. Because it started in our nervous system, creating dysregulation in our nervous system. That created changes in our biology. One of those changes is activated microglia. I said primed because primed means that they are not the same. They are more sensitive to stress. And now with stress, they become activated and they contribute to oxidative stress and contribute to nervous system dysregulation. So our own biology perpetuates the nervous system dysregulation. That's such an important point for you to know about your body and your nervous system. Your own biology is now creating, perpetuating, contributing to the nervous system dysregulation. And that is why, my friend, it will never be enough to just focus on the mind work, the mindset work. Because what are you doing with your microglia? What are you doing with that oxidative stress that the microglia create every time that they're activated with new stress? What about the somatic memories that our body holds? These movements that need to be completed, these memories of powerlessness, these memories of not speaking up for ourselves, not being able to do things. Those somatic memories do need to be completed. And are they going to be enough? Well, what about the microglia? What about this oxidative stress? So knowing that we have primed microglia, whether or not we know we were sleep trained with cry it out, or for other experiences, I've had a lot of head injuries in my lifetime, but there can be even something as simple as whiplash. Or I've already explained that high levels of emotional distress can cause that. Lack of oxygen. Did you have any of those experiences? Because those will prime microglia. And what you need to know is that those microglia will need your attention in order to have that repair and no longer live under the effect of the past trauma that you've had. And I'm seeing a question coming up. Hi, Dr. Amy, can you clarify something for me? I've heard different folks explain this differently. Is freeze really an active state where you can at any moment mobilize back to fight or flight? Or is freeze actually considered the shutdown? That is a great question. And let me share with you kind of where the body is at, especially in regards to this primed microglia. So let me pull up what the graph that I share in chapter 1 of my book on these 5 steps, because these 5 steps are the inner experience of how our body experiences trauma. So you're specifically asking about the freeze response here. Now, the freeze response is just after this yellow line, which I call the critical line of overwhelm. And so on this side is the stress response, but the freeze response is still a high sympathetic tone, and it is past the critical line of overwhelm. Now, there is a difference between what we feel inside and what we do externally. So there is still a possibility that even though we've experienced that freeze response, we've crossed that line, and there's no crossing back over that line without experiencing some of that shutdown, we can still stay in movement. It's not that we are paralyzed and can't move. No, the freeze is an internal state where we have our foot both on the gas pedal, so the adrenaline, and we have thrown on the emergency brake, so that the adrenaline is there, but it's actually blocked and not allowing us to move like we would normally do with adrenaline and the stress response. So where in this conversation is the microglia? The microglia, once we have primed microglia, our critical line moves so that it's closer to where our stress response is building. So we will reach that line, we will reach the line and cross the line earlier than if we didn't have primed microglia. When we learn how to support our primed microglia, then we can move that line and have more capacity for stress, meaning we're able to handle more stress before we go into that freeze response. So let's look at a few ways to do that. I want to end with some high action. Here's what you can do. If you have had early childhood adversity, if you have knowledge that you experienced overwhelm early in life, then you can know that your biology was affected. And here are some great ways to start with the primed microglia. Vitamin C is one of the most inexpensive ways that you can support the antioxidant repair that needs to happen in our biology. So vitamin C is a great antioxidant. N-acetylcysteine is a great supplement to help increase our glutathione levels, but also to directly decrease brain inflammation. Finally, sleep. Sleep is the time when our brain clears out all of that oxidative stress and the garbage that needs to go out from our brain. So prioritizing sleep. Now, I know that it's very common to have sleep problems, and I do know that the more that you can make quality sleep a priority, meaning invest in it, learn how to get quality sleep, track it, experiment. This was one of the reasons why I got an Oura ring, is for me to track so that I could know how to improve the quality of my sleep, knowing how important the quality of my sleep is for my microglia that have been primed in my lifetime. And I want to continue to know how to support them so that I can have a greater capacity for stress and not cross that line into overwhelm. With that, thank you for being here with me. Please go listen to that longer episode 132 with Dr. Narvaez. It was one of the most insightful podcast episodes that we've done, exploring early life and exactly what are some common parenting practices that may have actually started a biology of trauma. Until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Amy.